Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar, Designing for Inclusion with Ethical AI. I'm Barb Hyman, founder and CEO, and we're really glad that you can join us today. You'd have to be blind Freddy to miss that there's a huge amount of AI technology that's coming into our world. And there's a lot of confusion and fear, legitimately, around whether or not you can trust it and whether it's going to do the right thing for your organization and your people. And, at Sapia, we've been doing this since 2018, working in AI before people started to appreciate the power of technology like GPT. And we've been studying inclusion intimately with candidates that are going through our AI interviews. Around about 8 million now have completed an AI interview with Sapia across 23 countries. And something that we have seen, and I feel very proud of this, is that inclusion is able to be delivered at scale if you design it right from the beginning to be inclusive in terms of your experiences. It is not just about the AI, it's also about the whole end-to-end experience. And ultimately, what you deliver when you're doing that is the ability for people to be seen, heard, and hired. And that's certainly why many of our customers have signed up to use Sapia. Okay, so who's on this? So I'm Barb. I come with a very unusual background, and in fact, my CV is the perfect example of why you shouldn't be relying on CVs to hire. There is nothing in my CV or LinkedIn profile that would suggest that I should be in a role like this. And that is very much part of why you would turn to AI, is the ability to truly see potential and not judge people based on what sits on their CV. I was a lawyer in my early days and spent time as a CHRO. And as I said, we've been doing this now since 2018. I'm joined by the very impressive Kate Young, who has 20 plus years of working in the assessment space, our head of people science. So, why are we still having this conversation about inclusion? It feels like one that has gone on for some decades. Well, when we look at the data is still telling us that our workplaces are not inclusive, because when you look at representation, particularly at the top of organization, you're still seeing it heavily biased towards a couple of demographics. There's one data point I remember in Australia, which is that you have more men named Tony who are CEOs of listed companies than you do women who are CEOs of listed companies. But here are some data points to share for this market. And we're still seeing very much the archetypal male, pale, and stale, if I can use that phrase, that is sitting at the board level and the leadership level of organizations in the UK and Ireland. And so then the question becomes, do we care? Who cares? And should we try and fix it? What is the value of inclusion? And I know we talk about inclusion these days when historically we might have talked about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we're effectively solving for the same end goal, which is how do we have teams, leadership boards that represent the diversity of the markets that we serve and the people within our organization. So one pretty fundamental reason from a business perspective is because the people who are shaping, designing the products and services and workplaces of the future should look like the people who use them. And when you think of the number of examples that many of us are familiar with where that has not been the case, and we've seen quite disastrous outcomes, whether it's the Apple Health app, where it didn't acknowledge for women who menstruate, crash test dummies that were built for men, a lot of PPE that was built for men, you're obviously excluding a very large portion of society who are intended to be beneficiaries of these tools. And so that can create actually lives at risk, kill people in the case of the crash test dummies, or certainly exclude a very large portion of the market that you're going after. Another motivation is the research that's shown that the intersection of difference is what drives innovation. That ethnically diverse teams are much more likely to actually come up with new ideas rather than have homogenous teams reimagine how they do things. I've always said that disruption doesn't come from within. And, when you look at a business like Sapia, yes, I understand the HR market really well, but actually the real innovation comes from our data science team because they're thinking in a very clean, pure, unbiased way around the problem. And from that, you really see incredible innovation from difference. Another one is around when we all think alike and we're making decisions, we can tend to echo each other and be in a bit of an echo chamber of homogenous groups. And you certainly don't want that in an organization. You want to be able to see differences come to light, see sunlight, and that's much more likely to be the case when you've got diversity around the table, and then more likely to be differences that lead to better decision making. So, debate drives much better business outcomes, and there's research that speaks to that as well. When you look at the financial side, certainly as a woman who's taken time out for having kids, and I think about what I've been able to contribute back to the economy in paying taxes since I've returned to work, but think of all the people out there who are not being paid at parity, and the talent that the economy is missing out on because of really differences in how we view talent and identify talent. So I think it's pretty clear that the problem is still there, that it makes a difference for us to solve it from a number of different lenses. And the question becomes, can AI help? And what can you do about it in your role? So the starting point is the recognition and the clarity to say that the biggest problem around achieving any kind of inclusion is us, humans. We're not bad people. It's just biological that we have at least 144 biases. If you look at Wikipedia, most of which are unconscious biases. And if something is unconscious, it means that no amount of training is going to fix that. And that is something that was recognized by the UK government some years ago now, where they did some deep research looking at whether or not unconscious bias training, which had been going on for some years during the civil service, actually made a difference to outcomes. And they found that it didn't. And so they basically abandoned that approach to solving for inclusion. And when you think about that, based on what I've just shared, the reality of bias, bias is a wonderful shortcut to decision making. It's much easier to make a decision if you rest on the prism of your own experience, what good looks like, than if you have to challenge that and disrupt your own thinking. So it makes sense that so many of us turn to that when we're making decisions. But you cannot interrupt human bias. You need a different approach to interrupting human bias. So, how do we actually then solve for that? Well, interestingly, there are so many sites that I look at in my job where I'm seeing organizations that have incredibly positive, high positive intent around inclusion. Particularly we work a lot with the retail sector, the healthcare sector, many of which are dominated by women working in frontline roles. And so they want to signal and actually be inclusive in their hiring, but yet they're still relying on the CV. And this is not going to serve you very well. So the challenge with using a CV as a data set, and the CV's been around since Leonardo da Vinci. So, it's very deeply ingrained in our psyche, in our processes to rely on the CV or the resume. There is so much research. This is just a few examples that's been done over the decades around the fact that you cannot debias a CV. Removing the name does not help because you have lots of indicators around gender, socioeconomic experience, ethnicity that sit below the name level within a CV. And when you're relying on technology that is taking the CV and using the data within a CV to identify who's your strongest match, you are just perpetuating that bias. So the first challenge we have to make is to look for a way to, deliver inclusion without relying on the CV. So what are your options, and can you actually design for inclusion? So what Sapia's been doing as a framework, and back in 2018, 2019, when regulators were not really doing anything in the space, and we wanted to build our own frameworks around how do we design for inclusion. You can't just magically have it happen. And it's absolutely more than just the AI and the training data. I know we're all obsessed about what data we're using, and obviously you don't want that to be CV data, but fundamentally you have to do more than just obsess around the training data. You actually have to design your entire ecosystem of hiring for inclusion. And so we built this framework called FAIR AI for recruitment. It's probably our most downloaded piece of collateral. It's really vendor agnostic in many ways. If you're engaging in a process within your organization of trying to build foundations on how do you make good decisions around using AI responsibly, this is a really great starting point. And the fundamental framework talks about two dimensions. One is when you look at the product, what are you interrogating? And we think there are four critical dimensions, which would probably make sense to hopefully most people on this call. One is it inclusive in terms of how it's designed? Is it unbiased, which is measurable? People often worry about, is AI biased? Well, the beauty of AI is it's data, and data can be visible and be measured in a way which we humans often don't know our own biases. Is it explainable? That is now absolutely prescient in the context of the EU AI Act, is that you have to deliver insight about people when you're informing decision making, which people can understand? Can you actually explain why someone is being recommended for a role? And then obviously there's validity, which Kate can dive into. We also think there's another element, though, of looking at what drives fairness, and that is around how you treat data. Is data being kept in country? Is it going offshore? What third-party processes are you using? Is the team diverse? We have to obviously walk the talk in our own team. We measure our diversity on an annual basis, and we take a very broad view of that. It's not just what you can see on our faces, but it's actually also in our backgrounds. How many people have university education versus how many don't, for instance. So we really maximize diversity. And then transparency. So I encourage you to really reference this in your own approach, and it's a great way to build rigor into your decisioning around using AI. So if we just apply that framework of FAIR to a couple of ways in which many organizations are going to market for talent and making decisions around people, and we start with the video and this proclamation that I'm making, which is that video is the fastest route to productizing diversity and killing diversity, particularly when you're relying on AI that is using video data, which can't be explained. There was some legislation in the US that came in Illinois because people felt that the data that was being used to assess whether they were the right fit and they had the right skills was um, uh, um, biometric data, which is not visible to the candidate, not something that they're aware of, or data that even reflects their background. So when you apply the lens of is it inclusive, is it fair, is it explainable, you start to realize that that way of using data actually is pretty challenging from a fair framework perspective. And there, again, is plenty of research that speaks to the bias that we bring as humans. The first thing we see is someone's skin color and their gender, and how we are then using that to make really critical life decisions. The next thing to look at is, okay, well, what if you're not using the video, but you're using the audio and you're transcribing the video responses to text, and then you're applying algorithms to infer and measure someone's skills and competencies? The challenge there is around speech to text and error rates in transcription. And those error rates are particularly high for those who have English as a second language. So you're inadvertently introducing adverse impact through using that kind of approach. And that's where you really need to get quite deep in terms of truly understanding how is the technology working, what data is it using, and what is the way in which you're ensuring that it is inclusive. The CV one, I don't need to go into because I've mentioned that, but I think many of you might have heard of the Amazon experience, which was it wasn't something they actually released in the wild. It was something that they tested where they took the resumes of those who were hired. They get 10 million applications a year, and they put them into two different groups. One is the hired and the non-hired, and then they built an algorithm to try and identify whether the applicant was closer to the hired group versus the non-hired. You run into the same problems that I mentioned before. It's not explainable. It's certainly not fair because of the data that sits within a CV, and therefore it's not going to be inclusive because we're very good at looking at heuristics like the schools people went to, the places that they worked at. Often we're using our own experience and engaging in mirror hiring, which just naturally creates exclusion. So let me pass over to Kate now and have her share with you some of what we've seen and how we've tried to address this challenge in the market.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kate Young, Head of People Science here at Sapia. So I think I probably know a number of you on the call, but I'm an IO occupational psychologist by background. Just going to share my screen, which will be the most challenging part of the talk. Okay, and let's just hop into slideshow mode. Okay, can we all see my screen? Lovely. Okay, biggest hurdle out of the way. All right, so I have the fun job of really getting to walk you through how we are addressing some of these challenges at Sapia, which is why this section is titled Inclusion by Design, Feature by Feature, because I'm going to get a little granular with all of you and talk about the specific design features and governance features we've introduced into the Sapia.ai chat interview to ensure we can really deliver inclusion. So it's helpful to have a little bit of mental model as to how we break this down and we think about this as I walk you through. Firstly, it's how we design for inclusion. So what are the specific product features governing the candidate experience that allow it to be truly inclusive? How we deliver. So how is that really showing up in the solution? And then governance. We are obsessed with governance at Sapia. We talk about it all the time, and it's how we're really ensuring we're tracking that data, reporting that data, and sharing that data to demonstrate that the solution is truly inclusive. Or perhaps if sometimes we run into some of our workflows where there are issues we need to address, we like to be really open about that, build in public, and ensure we're addressing those challenges in a timely manner. I've been working on developing talent science solutions for 20 years, and I always say to anyone buying one, if you meet a vendor who tells you their solution is unbiased, they're either fibbing or they haven't understood the term, because there is no unbiased assessment solution on the market today. What there are a number of good and ethical vendors who are doing their very best to mitigate as far as humanly possible. So I'm going to dive into some of that detail with you. And somebody please shout if my volume or pacing is off, and I will course correct. Okay, so first of all, in terms of designing for inclusion, if we're thinking about assessment and selection, being inclusive really starts with measuring what matters, measure what is relevant. Now, the best way to do that is to do a job analysis. Job analysis is a process usually conducted by occupational psychologists like myself, where we can spend many, many hours doing lots of desk research, focus groups, so on and so forth, to really understand the duties and responsibilities and skills associated with a given job. And if you do that process well, and you do it with rigor, you will only assess what's relevant for the job and not biased or relevant criteria, which is critical for inclusion. Now, others may have different experiences on the call, but certainly what I've experienced is job analysis is typically not done nearly enough in the UK. You get a little bit more in the US because the US traditionally has a more legislative culture. So there's more of a burden to spend the money to do these things up front. But because job analysis is expensive and time consuming and involves releasing a number of your expensive and busy stakeholders to go through the process, we don't do enough of it. By using ethical AI, we're actually able to deliver job analysis at scale. So we have a tool, she's called Jazz, Job Analysis Studio. And what we do is, firstly, we consume the job description and we really interrogate that job description because we know job descriptions can be flawed. They contain bias in their own way. We consume that and we have a conversation. We talk about what really matters for success on the job. Yeah, what is a great performer like? What challenges do people run into? That takes about an hour. We consume all of that. We also have a feature in there that will just run through the job description, clean it up, sort out any bias, so on and so forth. After that, what happens is we're able to identify the competencies that are truly predictive for success in the role in a super, super standardized way, dialing out all of that bias, but also being able to deliver at scale. I like to think of Jazz as the tool that really democratizes job analysis because it makes it available to everyone, enabling everyone to start their hiring process in a truly inclusive way. So you get a little you get she recommends 6 competencies typically. That is the number we need to see in a chat interview. And the rationale there, because another important principle of inclusion, if you're talking about ethical AI, is the human in the loop. At Sapia, we don't allow the AI to run unchecked, ever. There are multiple checkpoints where we make sure we're bringing in that expert review to ensure we're being fair and inclusive. So these outputs are always reviewed by humans, and we can overrule them if we wish to. Typically, about 90% of the time, we actually don't need to. Jazz does do a really strong job because it's trained on an awful lot of job descriptions. Okay, moving on to our next feature. So again, talking about design, we based the Sapia solution on a structured interview. Now, this is important because the structured interview has been demonstrated in pretty recent literature, 2022, which is quite recent in the academic literature world, to be most predictive of success on the job. So by using a structured interview, you're getting a method that will predict job success and measure things that are job relevant. That's really important. But the problem with structured interviews is they create space for all kinds of bias, which means your solution is potentially much less inclusive than it could be. And this is the problem we really wanted to solve for at Sapia, making sure we can predict the most amount of job performance, find the best applicants for our clients, but dialing out all of that bias that can impact inclusion. So instead, what we have is we have a chat interview. And you can see the animation there on the left of the slide. So we ask people 5 questions. Those questions are designed as part of the Jazz process off the back of those competencies. So they are rigorous behavior or situational based questions. So again, nothing irrelevant. We're not asking about people's hobbies or to describe themselves in 3 words or anything else that can feel intimidating or off-putting or irrelevant in a diverse environment. So they have the 5 questions. They answer each one in turn. There's no time limits. From an inclusive perspective, this is critical. I mentioned I've been doing this a really long time. One of the things I have been doing a really long time in talent science, where I've worked with more traditional solutions, is kind of been in charge of figuring out where we give people extra time, where they ask for it on a, say, if we think about those numerical and verbal reasoning tests or SJTs where they're timed, for example. The reality is giving someone extra time doesn't solve because the pressure, if time is something that is difficult for a type of candidate, for example, a candidate with ADHD or dyslexia, that pressure is still there. The anxiety is still cranked up. And the minute you crank up somebody's anxiety in a hiring solution, you are handicapping their performance, you're damaging their performance. So we just remove that. No time limit, no social pressure. So that kind of being observed and having to show particular behaviors is gone because again you're just typing and it can be really little things. You might have noticed when Barb and I are both talking, Barb tends to sit kind of perfectly composed. She's our CEO. She shows up beautifully. I fidget constantly, and I can be judged for that in an interview situation, but by having a chat interview that is taken away. There's no scoring of non-verbal information, again to reference that fidgeting. When you're meeting someone face to face, it is impossible not to judge their non-verbal interaction. There are various stats flying around. I think the most popular one says we do 80% of our, 85% of our judgment on people, how people communicate with us non-verbally. That is not relevant to the job, so we should not be judging it. So that is all dialed out. And then finally, appearance. And this can impact in a number of different ways when we're thinking about diversity inclusion. Firstly, how people from different cultures might choose to dress. But secondly, especially if we think about early talent, just simply having access to the smart jacket, the smart suit, that is not evenly distributed. So the chat interview, you can't see what someone's looking at. So already by choosing this medium, we've got a huge number of design features that enable inclusion at scale. In terms of delivering for inclusion, we don't think it's enough just to sort of say it and come out with some cute design features. We like to be really rigorous in our demonstration, which is why I'm showing you this slide. We publish really, really widely. We have a number of white papers, a number of peer-reviewed papers, all of which can be downloaded on our website that talk about the science of inclusion. We don't have time to go into them on the webinar today, but do please visit Sapia.ai and have a look at some of the science that sits behind all of this, because it's really important to us that we are completely transparent in our science and how we deliver for inclusion. Apologies. So just getting a little bit more into that science and some of the features that are enabling inclusion at scale in our solution beyond the chat interview experience. Bias testing. So I mentioned if somebody's showing up and saying their solution has no bias, I would question that every time. What's much more important is making sure you're monitoring bias in your different applicant flows. Even if when you stand up your initial solution, you see all groups are performing equally, which is what I mean by bias testing. Are all groups performing roughly equally? Is everyone getting a fair go? Sometimes there can be variations in the populations that are applying. Applicant spikes can cause difference in profiles. The London Olympics is always my favourite example, which I appreciate is a while ago now, but that caused the profiles of early talent applicants to UK grad schemes to go really different to what we'd seen the year before, and suddenly all of our bias measures were off, and I'm never quite sure why, but it was fascinating at the time. So that's why you need to have this automated testing in place. And I'll just deep dive into that a little more later. And that's why you need to do it in detail. So not just a total score level, at feature levels. So are there traits or competencies in your model or in your assessment process which are advantaging particular groups? We don't consume any demographic data. And this is really an important differential with a CV, because even though you may not be directly screening on demographic data, I hope nobody is, just having it visible can trigger a whole bunch of biases. We will only score the candidate's chat response. That is all. Talking of scoring, part of inclusion is to be really transparent and explainable, because when you're transparent and explainable, you allow people to challenge and it means your solution can get better. So when we share scoring with hiring managers, typically our candidates will get a score on each of those 6 competencies. It'll be out of 5. We'll provide a really detailed explanation as to how we arrived at that scoring. We arrived at this scoring because the candidate said this in question 2 and this in question 4. They showed this behavioural indicator. They gave us this piece of evidence. And crucially, every part of that explanation is job relevant. because the tool will link back to the original job description and competencies shared. So what we're doing is making sure nothing irrelevant is scored or consumed, and we're always being completely open in that model. Finally, we score the whole response on a forced choice. This to me is it's actually my kind of favorite inclusive feature of the product. And the reason for that is, and having worked a lot with traditional psychometrics, when we give somebody a traditional personality test or perhaps an SJT with a multiple choice response, people can feel really constrained by that, in particular neurodiverse candidates who get reports, again, often from a neurodiverse population, but from others too, that it's difficult to choose just one response. It doesn't reflect their whole experience. They want to offer more context, and that can lead to the experience being really quite jarring. We score a whole text response. So we're looking across all of the evidence someone gave us to make sure we're kind of honouring everything they've shared and looking right through to give them all of the credit for all of the diversity of experience they've shared with us. So just talking a little bit about delivery, if we come back to that CV point, this rather beautiful slide, which I cannot take credit for making, is doing a wonderful job of breaking down for us where bias is appearing in a CV. So geographic bias, where someone's lived, screening bias based on name. I can't remember the name of the study, but there was that very famous study, it was done at a university in Germany, whereby a candidate's CV, she was a female candidate, and three versions of her name went out. She had a westernized name, and then an Asian name, and then on the last CV she had a photo which showed her in some specific cultural dress, and the callbacks she got were far greater for the westernized name and westernized CV. So we have bias already there. Sort of kind of gap filler behavior here. Aesthetic bias. Some people are much, much better at designing a CV than others, and that is simply not a job relevant skill. I mentioned I can't take credit for this slide. That is because I have terrible design abilities, but that is not job relevant for being a head of people science, and so nor should it be rewarded on a CV. I don't know when photos started creeping onto CVs. Honestly, I think it was around kind of 2005, 2006 in the UK. But they are, of course, triggering a whole range of bias. And then we have, of course, class bias, affinity bias here with school status. The list goes on. And this is just from a fairly superficial breakdown of this CV. Instead, what we're doing is we're measuring what actually matters through that job analysis that I mentioned up front, and we're explaining it, and explaining it and explaining it some more. So you have the total score, which is always derived through a very clear rule-based model. There's no kind of spooky hidden algorithms taking place. And we clearly summarize the evidence we've used, and we link that back to the job description. So the candidate said this, which is linked to this in the job description. These are their relevant experience highlights. So it's not going to pull in anything that a CV would that's simply not relevant for the job. Key strengths, risk factors. And then we come to the competency scoring. So for each of those competencies that we identified back in that JAS process, we're really just breaking down all of the evidence and explaining it. So it can be challenged, it can be seen, it can be thoroughly understood. Finally here, this last point to highlight on this slide is the interview responses. So for a solution to be truly inclusive, you always need to be sharing what's the evidence, what are you judging someone on? And we always share somebody's whole responses back to the hiring manager. So there's complete transparency and explainability at all times. Then I talked about governance through inclusion. So this is something I'm personally obsessed with, and we have a number of different ways we ensure that our solution is fair. So we work with our clients through periodic checkpoints, QBRs, to review quarterly how their solutions are performing. So there's not going to be any unnoticed bias happening in the solution. We also give clients access to their own dashboards that allow them to monitor the diversity of the pipeline coming through and ensure they're achieving inclusion in real time. We have an automated system of bias alerts. So if we do find that women are performing at a much greater level than men, for example, it's a Slack alert system. It comes through to the people science team, and then my team can action it and take the right remediation just to do that course correction there. And then we keep monitoring. So this is a constant monthly process, or quarterly in the case of QBRs, so that really no stone is going unturned in ensuring that we are making sure the group's able to perform at equal or very near to equal degrees in our solutions for all of our clients. I mentioned we give clients access to their own data. Here's an example. So you can see here, we give them a fairness score. So that's just showing the ratio of women who progress through versus men. So 1.03, that's just indicating a near equal rate. And that's for Sapia, that's for our solution. Because inclusion isn't just about the kind of the top of funnel, your initial hiring solution that you use, it's about how people pass through your whole hiring process. We like to support our clients by monitoring their data on their behalf if they choose to share it with us. So this here is showing the extent to which the client hired at equal rates. And you can see in this wonderful example, they were hiring at near equal rates. And then you can see it just broken down here. So this is something we can provide for all of our clients. So there's no hidden issues we can always see. And when we see them, we're able to course correct. Okay, so you don't have to take my word for it. I'm just going to dive a little bit into the data. So this is our Humanising hiring report, which we published recently. You can visit our website for a copy. I recommend you do. It's actually a very good read. This covered 6 million chat interviews. We have the sample sizes for those of you, the data people on the call, and 60,000 video interviews over 15 industries. And what we did is we did a real deep dive to find out how are people really experiencing the solution, how are they engaging with it, how inclusive is it truly. First of all, what we found is our satisfaction scores are incredibly high, so just over 9 out of 10 across the candidate base, with over half our candidates choosing to give us 10 out of 10. Why is this relevant for inclusion? If a hiring solution is jarring, unengaging, doesn't feel like it's representing you, doesn't feel like you've got a chance to tell your story, have a fair say, represent yourself, that is all an indication that your hiring is not inclusive. And therefore, I think it shows up in where our candidates are so satisfied with the solution that we are able to achieve inclusion at scale and evidence it through the data. Oh, sorry, bit fastest finger there. It's also interesting that 87% of our candidates choose to provide a satisfaction rating. So we don't enforce this, it's optional. So 87% of people were motivated enough to tell us what they thought of the solution, indicating that ongoing inclusion and engagement. Apologies for muddling my words there. Just breaking down some of the themes we see coming up. So this is a sentiment analysis of the words people use. So people actually take the time to type what they think of our solution. And you can see kind of overwhelmingly, there's a sort of generic positive sentiment. People highlighting the ease of use, which is an important inclusive feature. If it's not easy to use, the chances are we've gone wrong somewhere. Low stress levels, a chance for self-expression and reflection, which again is a theme that comes up and up again in inclusive hiring. Am I able to tell you about me? Can I tell you about my whole self? And then finally, if we really kind of deep dive into the comparison between a chat interview, which I've just talked you through, the various features through which we ensure inclusion, and a video interview. So completion rate, up to 90% for a chat interview, whereas only up to 75% for a video interview. This is really telling because in both these cases, the prize, if you like, for completing was the opportunity of a job. That was true for both of these. In fact, for the video interview, the prize was nearer because the video interview is second stage. So really, we should have seen higher completion rates because candidates were nearer to that reward. Whereas what's actually happening is more people were dropping off. Video is losing candidates because they do not enjoy the experience and find it a useful way to talk about themselves. In terms of dropout rate, again, you can see similar statistics. So the chat interview, I think these two are reversed actually. Whoops. Okay, these should be the other way around because we had a smaller dropout rate for chat interview. Whoops, sorry. And then leakage rate here. So in terms of where people are starting and they're not completing, we can see again, it's much, much higher for video. People are finding a video interview a really uncomfortable experience. And it does really lead me to question as to their role in the process. Similarly, candidate satisfaction much higher for chat interview, engagement rate, people who choose to leave feedback much higher. Time taken is important. I'm a big fan of respecting the candidate's time. Again, if we think about it from an inclusion lens, different groups have got different amounts of time they can devote to job hunting, different commitments on their time, working parents, people working extra jobs, so on and so forth. And so, by offering a solution to the market where people are able to display their capabilities in a relatively short amount of time that doesn't drain them, we are helping to raise the bar on inclusion. And finally, accessibility, which is a metric of completion terms engagement, was much higher for our chat interviews. Okay, I'm going to pass the floor back to Barb to just talk us through this final closeout. Oh, Barb, you're on mute.
Maybe before we get to that, Kate, we've got a few questions if you wanted to take them. So one is, how do you measure
Oh,
engagement on chat and video interviews? Do you want to take that one?
of course. So we measure engagement through the number, or rather the percentage of candidates who chose to leave a feedback comment. Our hypothesis being if they get to an end of a hiring experience, and it's no one's favorite thing to do an assessment for a role, we know that, but if they get to the end and they still choose to leave feedback and continue to engage with us, we take that as a proxy for engagement.
The other one is, what percentage of candidates do we see completing on mobile versus laptop, and does that vary by chat versus video?
Um, so it varies by employer. I know that. So typically, if we're talking about our clients who might be doing kind of high volume retail roles, we're getting about 50-50 on laptop versus mobile. Whereas if we look at more professional hiring roles, it's more about 70-30 in favor of desktop. I have to confess, I don't know the statistics for video interviews, I'm afraid.
We can
But
share
if you
that
do,
later when
Barb,
we
yeah, we
share
can
it
share
out.
that.
I don't right now, actually, even though I love data. So are there any more questions that people have where you're curious to understand a bit more about whether it's the governance? Feel free to other alternative methods for data input during chat. You can speak. Do you want to take that one, Kate?
Sure. So we have enabled speech to text in the chat. As Barb alluded to, it's not our preferred method because there is an error rate and we're really open to that. But by enabling speech to text for candidates who are genuinely more comfortable speaking their answers, we're able to include them in the chat interview experience and allow them to use that medium. Speech to text is improving all the time, and we update that part of the software regularly so that we are absolutely minimizing our error rate. What's an interesting story I like to share in terms of this, like what the reasonable adjustment, can we enable this feature? Can we enable the other feature? Is I used to in all my previous roles, I'd sort of be the person people would call and go, what's the reasonable adjustment we can make? Can we have a bigger font? Can we have somebody be a scribe? Can we have extra time? Can we share the interview questions in advance? I'd get, a couple of those calls a month, typically in previous roles. And since leading the people science team at Sapia, I've had zero calls, which does suggest that the vast majority, if not everyone, is able to access the chat interview without needing an adjustment, which I think is something, Barb, we can actually be really proud of.
Okay, Kate, another question. Does our platform have any proctoring or detection mechanisms to ensure candidates aren't using AI tools to create their chat responses?
Yes and no. So we don't do proctoring, and there's a really good reason for that. We like to, and it's part of being inclusive, we like to engage with our candidates respectfully and from a position of trust. We know from all of our engagement stats and our high satisfaction stats that candidates enjoy completing the interview. They like telling us their own story. They like responding in their own way. So they are already motivated to be honest and authentic. Now, of course, that's not perfect. Again, nothing is. So we also have an automatically generated content detector, always a little bit of a mouthful, and that is designed to detect if candidates are using Gen AI to supply their responses. Again, it is quite gentle and respectful because that is an important tenet of the Sapia solution. So if it detects that someone is using AI, it will gently flag, hey, it looks like you're using AI. It's really important that you're honest and open. If they do it again, they'll get a second flag. What we typically find, and I cannot remember the number off the top of my head, is after one or two flags, most people stop using AI and choose to input their responses themselves.
Yeah, look, I think one thing just that Kate touched on there was the importance of transparency. And, something that I'm really passionate about, having come from the HR world, is I think that a key part of creating strong cultures is creating trustful cultures, and that starts and is reflected so much in how you make your people decisions. Many of us have been through that experience of someone we know who received a promotion and we're kind of aghast. How did that person get that opportunity? When you know that they, for some, may not necessarily live the values of the organization. And so I think trust it takes a long time to earn, but can be lost very quickly within an organization. And something that I would like more leaders to be thoughtful of is how is technology helping to create trustful cultures versus the opposite. For instance, when you're using data about me that is invisible to me, for instance, what's in a CV, and perhaps not necessarily using it with my consent in terms of how you're extrapolating determinations about my expertise and my competencies, that to me is not a recipe for trust. And so think about not just efficiency, we're all very driven towards automation to drive efficiency, but I think the decisions that you make around technology are massively impactful on your culture as well. A question, Kate, on do you have any outcome studies on hiring success, performance, retention, etc.? Great question.
We have lots. Yes, there should be a number of those on the website if you wanted to go over and download those of us. I'm sorry, those studies that our clients have signed off, we can share publicly. Please do so.
So we might just bring it to a close if there are no other questions. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Wanted to highlight that we're about to release a new piece of research. We see it as our obligation working in AI that we're also transparent with data, which is why so much of our data gets shared, obviously live with our customers, but also with the market. And this report is about how you can actually use AI to scale inclusion and deliver diverse hiring. One of the things that struck me when I was at the Inclusion Summit in London recently was the passion from CEOs like the CEO of Sainsbury's and others around inclusion, and what it meant for them and how they live that. But the challenge is that you can't scale a human positive intent. You really need to embed inclusivity in the way that you make your decisions so that you can do it at scale. And I think one of the wonderful things about the right AI is that you can deliver on diversity almost invisibly, which is very hard to do visibly in today's world. So if you're truly passionate about creating inclusion end to end, AI, the right AI, we would certainly see it in our data, is the pathway to do that without having to go through what can be quite a trialing process of engaging and winning hearts and minds on that in a world where, it's become quite politicized in some markets. So certainly scan for that if you'd like to receive that. Really appreciate your time. We're going to finish 2 minutes early. Enjoy your lunch and watch out for the webinar recording and also the deck. Thank you so much for joining.